So I like to talk about basically lifecycle service orchestration. Really, that's what MEF is moving into, and I'll talk about what we're doing and how this affects, I think, the virtual world. I believe that most of the communication service providers are going to move into very rapidly into what I call a digital service provider, which will involve a lot of virtualized services. So with that, how many service providers are in this room right now? Well, just a few. How many people have heard of MEF, MEF? Mostly all of them. How many believe MEF is heard of MEF just from carrier Ethernet only? Okay. Actually, so I believe more than carrier Ethernet. That's awesome. Okay, so let me just keep going here. So I'll cover a couple of things. Number one is there's a big changes happening, as you guys know, not only in the service provider community to kind of get modernized and automated and to deliver, all the services in real time and all the complexities that are in the network to try to automate them, all the things that we all know, the problems. However, the enterprises, the customers of the service providers are having a bigger challenge. These guys are faced with a multi-cloud hybrid strategy, and they really need to understand and get a handle not just on bandwidth and connectivity. That's not their issue today. It's about making that bandwidth and connectivity work, sure, but it's also having that application awareness to make sure the applications on the cloud side are working, because that food chain is enormous. And second, and most importantly, is to make sure that as they go to the cloud, everything is secure and they're adhering to all the regulatory and data sovereignty compliance issues they would deal with. So they're dealing with problems of issues that go beyond just basic connectivity. They're dealing with this hybrid multi-cloud strategy. So with this, what we've done at MEF is we've changed our vision. I've come on as a CTO for MEF about 2.5 years now. I came from Microsoft for 10 years in the global carrier group. So I know a lot about clouds. I know a lot about this idea of virtualization and applications. And part of that, I 35 years in networking. So I have a good networking background. And bottom line is that we've taken our market, which we have a lot of service providers. We've taken our $80 billion carrier Ethernet market, and we realize times are changing. And with this, we want to help our membership, mainly service providers, make that change. And it has to happen. The change has to happen. I'm going to show you why later. So what we're doing is we're talking about enabling our members to become cloud ready and deliver more than just carrier Ethernet, to deliver these virtualized services. And I'm going to describe that in more technical detail. And more importantly, to make that automated. Those services are not just virtualized, but they're also they're automated. So they're all done by machines and provisioned by machines. And more importantly, the subscriber tenant can just decide what they want, like a cloud, and all that thing flows through in the way of software and APIs. So really, what you see here is the subscriber main destinations today, are clouds, and to some private data centers where their private clouds might sit. But what we're seeing is that services are evolving to become cloud-like services. And what we see is this world is we've taken our carrier Ethernet rigor, that's been the gold standard for this $80 billion market, and continues to grow, and we are applying it at different layers. So our layer 1 services just came out, our IP layers are going to come out, and really what we're talking about is not the protocol levels, we're talking about the language, the definition, the behavior of what that should be. Now, everybody should say, well, optical IP, that's been around forever, who cares? But, there's never been a language that a subscriber can actually say, I want, and point to, and everybody can understand that language and that definition. So we've done that. But more importantly, the world is virtualizing. And what I want to talk to you about is this world about, as we go up the stack, SD-WAN becoming a huge how can I say this? Huge attention to everybody, to get everybody wanting to do something about this world of SD-WAN. It's the unification of the wide area network with the general policy and softwareization. But more importantly, I think security plays an aspect on that SD-WAN. I'm going to dig into in details here coming up. So we've realized this market's massive for our tenants, for our members. And so we want to make sure our members leverage their membership and for us to help them on this journey to transform themselves from just being a communication service provider, which is mainly on the connectivity side, to adding in and becoming a digital service provider, to adding in more than just connectivity, to take their platform, their connectivity platform, and build in all these rich services that gets higher value, higher margin services. That's the critical point. So what we did was we wanted to also apply automation. So in 2 years ago, we came up with this idea called MEF 55, which was around this idea of lifecycle service orchestration. To take those services and make them automated, we had to come up with a framework, which I'm going to show you in a second, that talked about these reference points and where APIs have to sit. And the reference points look like this. If you look at the same kind of diagram, we've decomposed the environment into these areas of these reference points. Between carriers, you get the idea of this idea of sonata interlude. These are reference points in musical terms. And then between the BSS systems to this orchestrator, we have legato, and down to the technology domains like SDN controllers, NFV manos, and so on, we have this idea of presto. Now, all of this is going to make sense in the slides coming up that are much more technical. And just keep your attention to these areas, because I'm going to describe that in an SD-WAN context, and specifically as it relates to security, which was the main part of the talk. I do want to let you know that next month at our big conference, MEF 18 in LA, we'll be talking about and releasing this in a development release. And this will basically talk about how two internet providers can actually order, get quotes, all done through automation. No more work orders, no more email, all that kind of stuff. Two machines can actually talk to each other and check an address, check for availability of that product, and then finally get a quote for price and order. So this is a really big deal in the telecom industry, if you can imagine. So this is our framework. I'm not going to get into it. It's our framework that we launched last year, but it's really focusing on two critical areas moving up the stack, SD-WAN security. And that's really what the main talk is going to be about. My apologies for spending so much time to get here, but I want to provide enough context to kind of get in the meats of this stuff. So when you think about it, what MEF done is we've taken on standardizing SD-WAN. So next month at MEF 18, we will release publicly and to our members a draft version, which is basically 3 months from a full standard, the full SD-WAN specification, which describes the framework, the constructs, which you're seeing here, edge, gateway, orchestrator, and all, and so on. And this was designed for managed SD-WAN. Now, most of SD-WAN today are done in islands, either DIYs by the enterprises or by operators who are doing it in islands. But they're not really tied it into the big systems of the BSS, OSS systems. But if you think about it, if SD-WAN is going to be running at scale, millions of tenants, it has to be tied into their operational systems, their business systems. And that's really what the spec is describing, is how to do that, both at the functional framework level and then finally at the orchestration level. So I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on this, but you can download this next month, watch for this, you can download the spec, and it talks about these main constructs, the edge, the gateway, and the controller and orchestrator. Now, the interesting thing is the orchestrator, the controller, because that's kind of where the APIs are going to sit that allows the operational system to talk to an SD-WAN environment. Now, what you see here is, in the same spec, is it talks about the underlay network. The orchestrator, the lifecycle service orchestrator, which is looking end-to-end on the services, has to understand the underlay in a managed environment. It can't, now this is within a service provider footprint, it has to understand the underlay to understand how to place the overlay and how well the overlay will run on the underlay. So we describe that in the spec, and you can see some of these constructs here of these underlay service definitions and these unipoints from a subscriber network. And this is all part of the service provider network. So this is part of the LSO has to know the underlay. And then it lays in the overlay, and we describe these as these tunnel virtual connections as our label and constructs, and then how they tie into the UNI and so on to create this overlay model. So the overlay as the underlay, you guys all know this, it's very simple stuff, but we're actually describing the specification. Additionally, in our specification, we're describing also how an application should perform. So we actually, in our specification, describe application behavior into groups, policy, and we give the ability to how to measure that policy and the application behavior to the performance objectives so that it can be tested and so on. So this is all part of the spec. Now, you ask me, how does this apply to automation? Well, you think about this in the same framework we just described. The orchestrator and the business system that all service providers have to have in order to run at scale has to hook into this island of SD-WAN. And this idea of legato, this idea of presto legato have to work. So a subscriber and tenant wants to set his SDN environment, set his ideas of destinations he want to connect to, sets the policy of application behavior, what the application should perform, mission critical, best effort, and as an intent. The business application has to interpret that, send it down this legato point, which is BSS to OSS, and the orchestrator has to distill that intent model into a very lower level business objectives, into performance objectives, technical service specifications. And then that has to be placed down into this controller, SDN controller from any vendor in what we call the Presto reference point through a set of API, even lower level APIs. So this is the stuff we are working on right now in the MEF, is to make this all happen from a managed level and not just talk about the specification from a framework. Now, would you look at this then finally has to work with the controller from a specific vendor who then applies their own proprietary protocols, IPsec with forward error correction or wherever, traffic steering, whatever they do. We don't get involved in that. We kind of stop right at the Presto layer. So this is the key takeaway is MEF is standardizing SD-WAN from a service definition, and more importantly, it's standardizing the APIs to anybody's SD-WAN vendor's environment through this open API called Presto reference point. So this is an example of all the various vendors. We have a lot of service providers involved in this project, all the top vendors involved in the standardization efforts. And the goal is that, if you think about it, you don't want a service provider to buy, a certain vendor and they have their own APIs and another vendor different APIs, and you're going to have this API, fragmented all over. We want open APIs so no matter whatever vendor you buy, whatever orchestrator you buy, there's an open set of APIs. So that's the next takeaway. Now, when we look at this problem and we apply this to an actual topology, and I've got 6 minutes, so I don't have to rush so much. You see the idea there that you set the intent, the subscriber sets the intent to a lifecycle service orchestrator, and a lifecycle service orchestrator is looking across, to set the objective to a lower level policy into the controller. The controller then does its magic and makes the connectivity come alive, applies the actual flow policies to the edges or the gateways and so on. So that's pretty straightforward. I already described this. But what happens next that's not kind of accounted for and which you have to think about, and this is the next part we have to start thinking and working about, is we have this idea of a universal CPE, and we have the idea that the VNFs for the SD-WAN edges could sit in an IS infrastructure in a public cloud. In fact, you'll see that very commonly. To get into Amazon or Azure, you'll put a VNF from a SD-WAN vendor into a VM in an IS infrastructure, and they can connect to the clouds. And what you're seeing is that there is no way today of an API that can control, for an orchestrator, control all the infrastructure parts of an IS infrastructure from Amazon or Google. Now, I'm sure there's commercial versions of this happening where you can buy, commercial vendor A or Z or X or Y, I don't want to name anybody, who has done both the APIs around the telecom side and also opened up APIs to Amazon and Azure to try to onboard this kind of area to onboard the actual environment to place the VNF of the SD-WAN edge in there. And you're seeing the same problem in the universal CPE. The universal CPE also has to have the ability to onboard the VNF and to have the full life cycle of the VNF. And you're seeing a lot of vendors today offering the universal CPE with all of the infrastructure around it. And that's also needs to be orchestrated. So today, it's a separate orchestrator here. It's a separate orchestrator, the public cloud side, to say, create me a VM to then put a VNF. Same thing over here. But really what you want is a lifecycle service orchestrator to be handling all of those domain orchestrators and the SDN controller. So this is a problem that has to be solved also. So we've not addressed this yet, and this is another part of the project we need to get into. What you're also seeing is SD-WAN is the gateway into the virtual world that goes into much higher valued services of what the tenants and the enterprises really want. They want a world of connectivity that measures application performance, that delivers a security posture no matter where they are, what device they are, and to what destination they're going to. And that's why SD-WAN has become such a big thing. It is the underlying foundational glue of delivering policy and delivering the overlay structures to then bolt in all these other security postures and other bump-in-the-wire intelligence. And that's really what I believe the enterprises want from their communication service provider. They want the ability to not just buy bandwidth, but very intelligent bandwidth that's secured and does much, much more application-aware, secure-aware, and other things that have not yet come into existence as we get connected cars and other kinds of stuff that'll happen in the future. MR, AR, VR, all the stuff that'll apply to businesses, we still don't know. There will be as part of this layer, all done by policy. So I think this is a very, very important aspect that you're going to see security, and I'm going to pick security, jump into this. So next year, in my keynote at MEF 18, I'll be announcing how we're going to be approaching security as a service. I believe enterprises want to buy security as a service, as something that they can digest and understand. Not technically, because most people don't understand it. They want to buy a service of maybe some of these categories of maybe network security and know exactly what they're going to get, not in this technical jargon, but what behavior they're going to get and what SLA they're going to get from that. And they might do the same thing for identity, or they might do it for endpoint security, but they'll get a behavior and understanding what is secured from and what they're not secured against. And then finally, I think we're going to be embarking in this area, and that will be tying into the whole SD-WAN environment, because I think the way I see it, SD-WAN will be the overlay, which will then add in bump-in-the-wire types of security functions that will exist also in the IS infrastructures, the public clouds, in the universal CPs, and in the POPs of the modern DSP. They'll have POPs. They'll be NFV with leaf spine fabrics and NFVI, and they will actually have a full NFV infrastructure that will have all these VNFs that will be tied in a service function chain, and they'll have VNFs also, for example, in front of a web server on a infrastructure as a service in a public cloud that they'll have to secure. They'll have VNFs at the edges that they'll have to secure, and they'll have all the connectivity parts for the SD-WAN. And all of this will have to be orchestrated not only with the SD-WAN parts, as I just described, then you'll also have to do this with the nano aspects of all these security virtualized aspects. And then you finally also have to talk to these infrastructures to onboard these VNFs like I just described. So this is a very complex problem that we're just embarking onto. And I guess what the end of the day is, the food chain is very complex compared to the older days of trying to make this work in physical or PNFs. This virtualized world will have distributed VNFs all over, and they have to be orchestrated from a single entity by a tenant portal. You don't want the tenant to come in and provision here and provision over here and provision over here and have all these different portals. That's not the experience they want. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of advertisement that we do have our own pro certs on SDN NFV and on what we call our network foundation that's happening on Friday for if you want to get certification. And finally, our big events, MEF 18, coming at the end of the year, end of October. It's a massive event, and you'll see a lot of providers talk about many of these subjects, including I'll cover some of these areas in security as a service. So with that, I'm at 0 seconds, and it's perfect timing. Any questions? Okay, thank you.